Her name was Margaret Ellery, and she was 43 years old when she bought the house on Alder Hollow Road, though everyone in the county still called it the Voss Place and would keep calling it that long after she was gone. She hadn't meant to buy a haunted house. Nobody ever does. What she'd meant to buy was a fresh start, cheap, remote, big enough to hold the silence she'd been carrying since the divorce, since the funeral before that, since the year that had taken her mother and her marriage within 4 months of each other and left her, standing in an empty apartment in Ohio, wondering what, exactly, she was supposed to do with the rest of her life. The realtor, a nervous young man named Cody Pruitt, who kept touching the knot of his tie like it might come undone and strangle him, had shown her the listing on a laptop with a cracked screen protector. "It's a lot of house for the money," he'd said, which she would later understand was the closest he was willing to come to a warning. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through second-growth pine for almost a mile before opening onto a clearing, and there it was, 3 stories of gray clapboard gone the color of driftwood, a wraparound porch with 2 support posts leaning at angles that suggested exhaustion rather than instability, and windows. So many windows, more windows than the house seemed to need, as if whoever built it had wanted every room to be watched by the woods or to watch them back. It had been built in 1889 by a timber man named Josiah Voss, who made his fortune stripping the hills bare and then spent the rest of his life alone in the biggest house for 40 miles, as if trying to fill with wood and glass what he could no longer fill with people. His wife had died young. His children had scattered west, east, anywhere but here. He died in an upstairs bedroom in 1927, and the house had passed through 6 owners since, none of whom had stayed more than 3 years, and one of whom, a family named Pruitt, no relation to Cody as far as Margaret ever learned, had left so abruptly that half their furniture was still in the attic when the bank repossessed it in 1994. Margaret didn't ask why it was cheap. She had learned in the last year of her life not to ask questions she didn't want answered. She moved in on the 1st of October, which she would later recognize as either terrible luck or a kind of gravity, the house pulling her toward it at the one time of year when the veil, as her grandmother used to say, gets thin enough to breathe through. The first 2 weeks were almost peaceful. She unpacked slowly, room by room, letting the process be a kind of meditation. She hung her mother's quilts in the downstairs hallway. She set up her laptop and her drafting table in what had once been Josiah Voss's study, a square room at the front of the house with a fireplace big enough to stand in a window that looked out over the gravel road, so she could watch for the mail truck, for company, for anything that might come. Nothing came at first but the quiet. She noticed the cold spot on the 3rd day. It sat at the bottom of the main staircase, a column of air maybe 3 feet wide that was reliably, inexplicably colder than the rest of the hallway. 5 degrees, maybe more enough that she started, keeping a cardigan on the newel post, and shrugging into it every time she came downstairs, without really thinking about why. She told herself it was a draft. Old houses had drafts. Old houses had 100 small cruelties baked into their bones. Bad insulation, gaps under doors, windows that had warped in their frames a century ago and never fit right since. A cold spot was nothing. A cold spot was structural. She noticed the smell on the 5th day, lavender, faint and sweet and entirely out of place, since she owned no lavender anything, no candles, no soap, no sachets in her drawers. It came and went. She'd catch it crossing the upstairs landing or standing at the kitchen sink, and by the time she turned her head to find the source, it would already be gone, like something had just left the room half-second before she noticed it was there. She noticed on the 7th day that the house had a particular way of settling at night, a long groan that moved from the attic down through the walls to the foundation, always around 11 p.m., always taking almost exactly 40 seconds to complete its journey, like something enormous turning over in its sleep. She lay in bed the first few nights and listened to it with the specific attentiveness of a woman who has recently lost everything and has nothing left to distract her from small mysteries. She told herself it was the temperature dropping, wood contracting. She had read that old houses did this. She had read a great many things in the weeks since the move about what old houses did and why, because reading about wood and foundations and thermal contraction was a great deal more comfortable than reading about what else a house that old might be doing and why and to whom. By the 2nd week, she'd stopped sleeping well, though she couldn't have said exactly why. She didn't remember waking. She only remembered some mornings, a peculiar tiredness in her arms, as though she'd spent the night carrying something heavy from room to room, and finding, when she checked, that small things in the house had moved, a chair pulled 2 inches from the table, a book on the study shelf turned spine in instead of spine out, the bathroom door, which she always left open, closed instead, latched, as if someone had wanted privacy. She started locking her bedroom door. She told herself it was for peace of mind. She did not examine too closely the question of peace of mind against what exactly. The first time she saw the woman was on the 17th night. Margaret had gotten up for water. She remembered that clearly, the specific mundane clarity of it, her bare feet on the cold pine floor, the hallway lit only by the green glow of a smoke detector, and she had passed the top of the stairs, and there, at the bottom, standing in the exact center of that column of cold, ere she had spent 2 weeks calling a draft, was a woman in a long gray dress with her back to the staircase, facing the front door entirely still. Margaret did not scream. She would think about this later, turn it over the way you turn over a strange coin, that her first response to seeing an impossible thing standing in her front hallway at 2 in the morning was not terror, but a kind of stunned, clinical disbelief, the same feeling as missing a step in the dark. She stood at the top of the stairs with her hand on the newel post, and she watched the woman not move, not breathe, not so much as shift her weight from one foot to the other, for what felt like both an instant and an hour, and then the smoke detector's light caught something at the woman's collar, a brooch, silver, shaped like a cluster of wheat, and the woman began, very slowly, to turn her head to bed. She did not remember deciding to. She remembered only that one moment she was at the top of the stairs, and the next she was under her blankets, with the bedroom door locked in her, heart going so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and that she did not get up again until sunrise, and that when she did, the cold spot at the bottom of the stairs was gone, evaporated with the dark as if it had never been anything but a draft after all. She told herself over coffee, in the flat, gray decency of morning light, that she had imagined it. Grief did things to the mind. Loneliness did things to the mind. She had read about hypnagogia, about the tricks a half-asleep brain could play on a person standing at the top of a dark staircase, and she believed, or made herself believe, every word of it, right up until she went to fetch the mail 3 days later and Cody Pruitt's mother, who ran the general store 9 miles down the highway, and who had, Margaret would learn, buried 2 husbands and outlived every rumor in the county, looked at her over the register and said, without being asked, "You're sleeping in the Voss house." "I bought the Voss house," Margaret said. The older woman rang up her groceries without looking at them. "You seen her yet?" Margaret's hand went still on her wallet. "Seen who?" "Don't matter," the woman said, and would say nothing else on the subject. Not that day, not for weeks. No matter how Margaret asked, except as Margaret was leaving, the woman added one thing quietly, like a woman passing on a recipe she wasn't sure she should share. She was Josiah's second wife. Not the first one. The first one everybody remembers. It's the second nobody talks about, and that's the one you want to worry over. That sentence, "That's the one you want to worry over," would come to sit in Margaret's chest like a swallowed stone for the rest of the autumn, because it was the first indication she had that this house's story was not the simple, tidy tragedy the sale listing had implied. A grieving timber baron, alone in his big house. That was the story she'd been sold, and it was a sad story. But sad stories don't reach up out of the past and stand at the bottom of your stairs at 2 in the morning. She started digging. The county records office was a 40-minute drive and staffed by a single archivist, an elderly man named Pruitt. Everyone here, it seemed, was named Pruitt or married to one who unlocked a filing cabinet for her without being asked twice and said only "Voss place." "Huh," in the same flat tone the store owner had used, as though the house's name alone was a kind of shorthand that the whole county had agreed wordlessly never to finish out loud. What she found over the following days in property records and a single water-damaged parish register and a newspaper archive that hadn't been touched in decades was this: Josiah Voss had married twice. His first wife, Eleanor, had died in 1891, 2 years after the house was built, of what the register listed only as fever. And there the trail on Eleanor went cold, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of death that happened to 1,000 women a year in that century and drew no more notice than the weather. But in 1896, Josiah had married again, a woman named Clara Munson, 22 years old to his 51, the daughter of a mill foreman who owed Josiah money. And Clara Voss appeared in the parish register exactly twice more after her wedding. Once, in 1899, in a baptismal record for a stillborn son, and once in 1901, in a death register that gave no cause at all, just a name, a date, and a single word in the margin, written in a hand so tight and cramped it looked like the pen had been pressed in anger. House. Not in the house. Not at the house. Just house. As if the recorder hadn't known how else to explain it, or hadn't wanted to. Margaret sat in the archive with that register open in front of her for a long time, the cold October light coming through a high window, and she thought about the woman at the bottom of her stairs, the gray dress, the wheat-shaped brooch, the impossible stillness of her, and she thought, 22 years old. And she thought about her own house, and the cold spot at the base of the stairs, and the fact that the front door was the last thing that a woman standing exactly there would be facing, as if she had spent more than a century waiting for someone to either come through it or to finally let her leave. Margaret didn't go up to the attic for the first 3 weeks. It wasn't fear, exactly, or it wasn't only fear. It was that the stairs to the attic were narrow and steep and folded down from a hatch in the ceiling of the third-floor hallway, and getting the ladder open required more strength than she wanted to spend on a Tuesday, and there was always something else to unpack first. That was the story she told herself. She was getting good by then at telling herself stories. What finally sent her up was the smell. It started small, a mustiness, sweetish, like a fruit going soft in a bowl nobody had emptied, and she chased it for 2 days before she understood it was coming from directly above her bedroom, from the one part of the house she hadn't opened. She stood under the attic hatch with a flashlight in one hand and her phone in the other, as if a phone would do her any good a mile up a gravel road with no signal, and she told herself, it's an animal, a squirrel, a raccoon, something that crawled in and died in the insulation, the way things do in old houses. This was, she would think later, the single most reasonable explanation she came up with in the entire autumn, and it was also the only one that turned out to be wrong. The attic ran the full length of the house, low-ceilinged at the eaves and open in the center, lit by 2 round windows at either gable end that let in a weak, dust-thick October light. It was exactly what Cody Pruitt had warned her it would be: furniture under sheets, trunks stacked 3 deep, the leftover skeleton of the Pruitt family's abandoned 1994 exodus. Everything gone the uniform gray of things that have sat undisturbed for a long time. She found the smell's source almost immediately, a water stain spreading across the floorboards near the chimney, old, dried at its edges, something that had happened long before she'd bought the place and had simply chosen this week to announce itself. Nothing dead, nothing animal, just wood remembering water. She should have gone back down then. She told herself she would, right after she looked in the trunks. The first 2 were unremarkable: moth-eaten linens, a rusted sewing machine, a box of Christmas ornaments from some decade in the middle of the last century. The third trunk was smaller, iron-cornered and locked, and it took her almost 20 minutes with a flathead screwdriver from the kitchen to force the hasp, and when she finally got the lid up, what she found inside was not what she expected from a house that old. Not linens, not dishware, but paper. Layers of it. A woman's things, kept with a care that felt, even after all this time, deliberate, as if someone had wanted this specific trunk to survive, wanted it more than they'd wanted the sewing machine or the ornaments to survive. There was a Bible, the family record page torn out. There was a small daguerreotype in a cracked case, a young woman in a high-collared dress, unsmiling in the way all portraits from that century were unsmiling, with a brooch at her throat that Margaret recognized before she'd fully processed what she was looking at, a cluster of wheat, silver, exactly the brooch she had seen at the bottom of her staircase 3 weeks before. And there was a diary. It was small, bound in dark leather gone soft, and cracked with age, and the first third of it was ordinary, the diary of a young bride, written in a careful looping hand, full of small domestic complaints and smaller domestic joys. Josiah says the north field will yield well this year. I have put up preserves. Margaret sat on the attic floor in the cooling light and read entry after entry of a life that sounded, if not happy, at least survivable, until the entries began gradually to change. He does not let me go to town without Ansel with me. One read dated more than 2 years into the marriage. He says it is for my safety. I do not know from what he thinks I need safeguarding, unless it is from speaking to anyone at all. Further on, the baby did not wake this morning. I have written nothing else today because there is nothing else. I can make myself write. That entry sat alone on its page, the rest of it blank, and Margaret felt something go cold and slow in her chest, because she knew from the parish register exactly what year that would have been. 1899, the stillbirth, the beginning of the end of Clara Voss, though Clara, writing it, could not have known that yet. The last dozen entries were the hardest to read, not because the handwriting grew wilder. It didn't. If anything, it grew smaller, tighter, more controlled, the hand of a woman working very hard to hold something together. But because of what they said plainly, without any of the earlier entries' softness, he believes I mean to leave him. I have told him I do not, because I have nowhere to go and no money of my own, and Father will not have me back now that the debt is settled by my marriage. But he does not believe me, and he has begun to lock the door of my room from the outside at night. For my own good, he says, so that I do not wander in my grief. I am not permitted downstairs after dark. I have started counting the stairs. There are 14 between my door and the hall below. I do not know why I count them, except that it is something to do with my mind. That is not thinking about the rest of it. And then the final entry, dated 4 days before the date in the parish register, in handwriting that had, for the first time in the whole diary, begun to fray at its edges. He says if I try the door again, he will make certain I never have cause to try it a third time. I do not think he means it as a figure of speech. I have begun to understand that he does not, in fact, intend to let me leave this house. Not while I live, and this is the part. I can hardly make myself right. I am no longer certain he intends to let that condition limit him for very much longer either. Margaret closed the diary. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were shaking. House, the death register had said. Not a place. Not an accident of geography. A cause. She should have called someone. She turned this thought over for days afterward. Who exactly was she going to call, 125 years after the fact, to report a murder with no living witnesses and no living suspect, in a county where every official she'd met so far had responded to the mere mention of her address with the flat, closed-off tone of people protecting a communal silence they'd inherited rather than chosen? What she did instead on the night she finished reading the diary was something she would later recognize as either very brave or very foolish, and possibly both at once. She went and stood at the bottom of the stairs in the cold spot at 11 o'clock, and she said out loud into the dark and empty hallway, "I read it. I know what he did to you." Nothing happened for a long moment. The cold pressed in around her, sharper than it had been on any previous night, sharp enough that her breath went visible in front of her. And then from the top of the stairs, not a voice exactly, not at first, but a pressure, the sense of being looked at by something that had waited a very long time to be looked back at, came a sound, small, deliberate, a single word, spoken in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere in the stairwell at once, thin and dry as paper. Down, Margaret's whole body went rigid. "What?" "He kept me," the voice said, and now it was clearer, closer, though Margaret could see nothing at the top of the stairs but darkness. "Up, always up. I only wanted at the end to be down." And then the cold broke, all at once, like a held breath finally released. And the hallway was only a hallway again, and Margaret stood there, alone with her heart slamming, and the diary clutched against her chest, and understood, with a certainty that settled into her like a stone dropped into still water, that she was not going to be able to leave this house until she understood exactly what Clara Voss needed from her, and that whatever it was going to cost her something to give it. The morning after the voice at the stairs, Margaret drove into town before she'd even made coffee, the diary on the passenger seat, like something that might change its mind about staying, closed if she left it alone in the house too long. She went, this time, not to the general store or the archive, but to the one place in the county she'd been avoiding since she moved in, the small brick building with library, painted over its door in letters gone the color of weak tea, staffed, as it turned out, by a woman who was not named Pruitt, which alone was enough to make Margaret trust her a little more than she'd trusted anyone else in the county so far. The librarian's name was Denise Okafor, and she'd moved to the area 11 years earlier from Charlotte, married a local man, and inherited, along with his last name and his grandmother's quilts, the specific outsider's clarity that lets a person see a small town's silences for what they are instead of just accepting them as weather. When Margaret said the words Vaux's house and Clara in the same sentence, Denise didn't do what everyone else in the county didn't go flat and careful and start finding reasons to look at something else. She closed the browser tab she'd been working in, folded her hands on the desk, and said, "You're the fourth one to ask me that in 11 years. Fourth owner?" "Fourth person," Denise said. "Not all owners stayed long enough to come asking questions. Some of them didn't stay long enough to unpack." She pulled a folder from a locked drawer beneath the desk. Not a county record, she was careful to clarify, but her own years of newspaper clippings and half-remembered conversations. She'd assembled the way some people assemble a hobby, because the story had gotten its hooks into her too, the way it apparently got its hooks into everyone who lived close enough to hear it. "I'm not a professional at this," she said. "I just got curious, and then I got worried, and eventually I started writing it down so I wouldn't feel crazy." What was in the folder amounted to this. After Josiah Voss died in 1927, alone in an upstairs bedroom, the same one Margaret would later confirm with a chill that she had chosen for her own, the house passed to a nephew who sold it within the year, unable to settle, the clipping said without saying into what. The family that bought it next, the Hendersons, lasted 4 years before a fire gutted the east wing in 1931. No one was hurt, the article noted with a strange, pointed carefulness, as though the writer had wanted very badly to say more and had been prevented. The Hendersons did not rebuild. They sold the land and the shell of the house to a timber concern that did nothing with it for 30 years, and then in the 60s, a family named Colby restored it and lived there for a decade, the longest anyone had managed, before leaving abruptly in 1971, an event Denise had only ever gotten a half account of secondhand from an elderly parishioner at her husband's church who claimed to have heard it from her own mother that the youngest Colby daughter, 9 years old, had woken every night for a month insisting a woman stood at the bottom of the stairs and would not let her come down for water, and that the family left within the week of the girl waking up with finger marks. Not bruises exactly, the old woman had said, but marks like something had held her wrist around one thin arm. After the Colbys, 2 more owners in quick succession, both gone inside 3 years, and then the Pruitts, the ones who'd left half their attic behind in 1994, a family Denise remembered, slightly better because she'd been newer to town then, and the story was still fresh gossip. The Pruitt mother, no relation. Denise confirmed to either the store owner or the archivist. Just one more of the county's endless overlapping. Pruitts had told anyone who'd listened before they left that something in the house did not want her going up the stairs at night, and something else did not want her going down them, and that living inside those 2 competing wants had felt, she'd said, like living inside a held breath that never got let out. 2 things, Margaret repeated slowly. Not one. That's what she said. Denise closed the folder. You want my honest opinion. Since you asked me a question, nobody in this county has been willing to actually answer in 11 years. I think there's a woman in that house who wants to leave, and something else in that house that has spent 125 years making sure she can't, and every family that's ever lived there has ended up standing in the middle of that fight, whether they meant to or not. Margaret drove home with the folder on the seat beside the diary, and she did not sleep that night. Not really. She lay in bed with the door unlocked for the first time since she'd moved in, some instinct telling her that locking herself in was no longer the safe choice it had once felt like, and she listened to the house breathe its long nightly groan at 11 o'clock, and underneath it, for the first time, she heard something else, a second sound, lower, slower, moving not down through the walls the way the house's settling always did, but up, starting somewhere in the foundation and climbing, floor by floor, toward the attic, toward the room at the top of the house where Josiah Voss had died alone in 1927. She got up. She would ask herself for the rest of her life why she got up, why curiosity had so thoroughly outrun self-preservation in her by that point in the autumn, and she would never have a better answer than, because someone had to, and Clara Voss couldn't. The upstairs hallway was warm, unnaturally so, a full reversal of the cold that lived at the bottom of the stairs, as if whatever occupied the top of the house ran on a different temperature than whatever occupied the bottom. 2 separate weather systems sharing one building. The door to Josiah's old bedroom, which Margaret had left ajar out of nothing more than habit, stood shut. She did not remember shutting it. She put her hand on the knob, and from the other side of the door, close, as though someone stood with their face nearly against the wood, a voice said, not Clara's thin, dry paper voice from the stairwell, but something heavier, older, with a rasp in it like a saw dragged slow through green wood. This was never your house to open doors in. Margaret took her hand off the knob. Behind her, at the far end of the hallway, she heard faint and getting fainter, as if retreating down through the walls the way it had come up. Clara's voice, urgent now, stripped of its earlier careful stillness. Don't. Not that one. Come away from that one. Margaret backed away from Josiah's door, one slow step and then another, and the warmth of the upstairs hallway seemed to follow her, pressing at her shoulders like a hand that hadn't decided yet whether to push or pull. Behind her, Clara's voice kept fraying at the edges of the dark. Come away, and somewhere beneath the floorboards. That second sound was still climbing, patient, unhurried, the sound of something that had all the time in the world, because it had already spent a century proving it. She made it to the stairs and went down them 2 at a time, and the cold spot at the bottom rose up around her like water, and this time, for the first time, she didn't stop at its edge. She stepped into it. She let it close over her. Tell me, she said, teeth already chattering, what he did. All of it. I need to know what I'm standing in the middle of. The cold thickened, and Clara's voice came from very close now, no longer thin, no longer just paper. Something in it had gathered, over the course of that long autumn, enough strength to sound almost like a living woman, again, tired and precise. He did not let me go, she said. Not in the marriage. Not after. I told you he locked my door. What I did not tell you, what I could not make myself right, even at the end, is that on the night he came to make good on what he'd promised, I did not go quietly. I had the fire poker from my room. I had by then very little left to lose. Margaret felt the cold spot pulse, once, like something remembering pain. You fought him. I hurt him, Clara said. Badly. Enough that he did not finish what he came to do that night. But a man like Josiah Voss does not forgive being made to bleed by his own wife, and he did not intend to give me a second chance to try. He'd put me in the room at the top of the house, his room, so he could keep me where he could watch, and he told the doctor I had taken a fever, and he made certain, over the 4 days that followed, that the fever was true by the time anyone thought to ask. I died where he could watch. That is the whole of it. That is what house meant in the register, because the man who wrote it knew and was afraid, and could not bring himself to write the truer word. And him, Margaret said. Josiah, what's up there now in his room? Is that him? It is what was left of him, Clara said, after 26 more years alone in this house with what he'd done. He did not die peacefully either, Margaret Ellery. He died believing I had never left. He was correct. I had nowhere else to go, and he had made certain of that in life as much as after it. We have shared this house for 125 years, myself at the bottom of the stairs where I chose to make my stand, and himself at the top of them, still believing, even now, that a locked door is a mercy. Every family that's lived here, Margaret said slowly. The Fires, the Colby girl, the Pruitts leaving half their things behind. That's you, too. Still fighting whatever's left of that fight. He does not want to be alone in his grief, Clara said, and I do not want anyone kept from theirs. When a family lived quietly and left him be, he left them be, mostly. When a woman in this house grew afraid or unhappy, or began, as you have, asking questions he did not want asked, he grew jealous of my attention and unkind. I am sorry for what the Colby child suffered. I have spent a very long time trying to keep the worst of him contained to these stairs and this hallway so that it touches as few people as I can manage. I have not always succeeded. Margaret stood in the cold, shaking, and understood, with the specific clarity that only comes very late at night in a house that has stopped pretending to be ordinary, what she was actually being asked, underneath everything else. Not to solve a murder a century cold, not to bring anyone to justice that no court on earth could touch anymore, but simply, finally, to let one woman go down a flight of stairs she had died forbidden to use.